Hi, guys. So we are in the Disease and Medicine in the Middle Ages folder, and we're doing the Black Death in Medieval Europe today. Your notes for my online learners, my in-person learners, they are in front of you. My online learners, your notes are here. Okay. So we're going to open this guy up. All right. So today we're going to talk about the Black Death or the Black Plague or just the plague in medieval Europe. And sorry, my computer's being very slow. All right, there we go. So we think that the Black Death or the Black Plague or the bubonic plague spread from Asia along the Silk Road and then ended up in Europe. And we talked yesterday about all of the different reasons why a disease would spread really quickly. We're going to go back and kind of revisit some of those today. So the plague likely started in Asia and traveled westward on the Silk Road. The disease was carried by fleas that lived on rats. So the rats themselves did not spread the disease. It is the fleas that live on the rats. And so historians think that the black rats living on the European merchant ships actually caught the disease, and then the fleas would travel on the rats to these different places. The rats would be on the ships and inside the food containers and all of these things. And then as they traveled, they would drop the fleas off onto other rats, and then so on and so forth. And again, remember, people are living in really, really bad conditions, so there's fleas on their bodies as well. All right, so we talked about the houses yesterday, but people in the Middle Ages didn't know that disease was carried by rats. They also didn't know that, coughing on somebody caused disease. They didn't know a lot of things. They did know that using blankets of someone that had been sick could get you sick too, which is common. But that was only for some diseases. They didn't understand how others were transferred. This is a picture over here of a medieval village, and you can see how close together these homes would have been. And remember, we talked about this overhang would have been hanging over the person next to you. It would have been hanging over their house. And so these areas were so tight, they were so contained that oftentimes you couldn't even see the sky. Airflow was so bad in these medieval cities. They were really, really dirty. Tons of rats, because rats eat garbage. And so if you're dropping your garbage onto the ground, there's plenty of food for the rats. And so sometimes entire towns and villages were wiped out by the plague. So here is just a really good map to kind of show you. This is where the merchants would have started. The plague would have traveled along this route, and then it would have ended up in Constantinople first. And then from Constantinople, it would have traveled across the Mediterranean into North Africa, and then up into Italy and into England, Iceland. So it really was a multi-continent plague. You had most of top of Africa. Egypt was affected. India was affected. I mean, all of this whole area of the world. So let's talk about some facts. The Black Death is also called the bubonic plague. And we hear about the plague all the time in our common 2021 lexicon. You hear about Botox, which is used for all sorts of different things. Dentists use it to prevent lockjaw or grinding your teeth. People use it to prevent wrinkles. Doctors use it to paralyze certain muscles so that you can relieve pain. It's got a lot of different uses. Botox comes from botulism, and botulism is the main component of the bubonic plague. So over time, we've actually harnessed this disease into something useful. But during that time, this was when, we hadn't obviously made it into usable form. But botulism still exists. And the plague, this form of the plague, actually does also still exist in certain parts of the world. Every now and then the news will pop up and say somebody died of the plague. 4 people died of the plague this year. It's the same plague. It hasn't mutated very much. During the 1300s, it was the deadliest pandemic in human history. It still is the deadliest pandemic in human history, I should say. It beats out the Spanish influenza in 1918 and the coronavirus. It peaked in Europe between 1347 and 1351, and it resulted in the deaths of up to 75 to 200 million medieval people. It also became something called endemic. We have a pandemic right now. It was endemic, meaning it would occur regularly. So every 60 to 100 years, it would pop back up. And this was because people hadn't developed either a natural immunity to it, or it would, mutate just slightly, and then they hadn't changed their living conditions. So bad living conditions leads to more disease, so on and so forth. It happened in Europe and the Mediterranean throughout the 14th and to 17th centuries. Most of the infrastructure of Europe, meaning the way Europe was set up, was gone when the Black Death finally subsided. So one of the not good things, but one of the things that happened was that feudal society, that serf all the way up to king, was gone, actually, by the time the plague was over. And so that led to a more equitable society and it also led to a healthier society, because those who could survive the plague left it stronger than those who sadly had died from the plague. Many people thought that the Black Death was actually a punishment from God. And so there was this idea that they had done something wrong. It also stopped the advancement of learning. People were very concerned about just surviving on a day-to-day basis. And so education that had started under Charlemagne and was really taking hold had kind of stopped. It leads directly to the Renaissance, when suddenly everybody is healthy again, and there's this huge birth of ideas and learning and science and art and, astrology and all this awesome stuff, because we weren't so concerned about just surviving. We could thrive. Some scientists think that the bacteria was called Yersinia pestis. There's some argument about whether it was this one or another form of botulism, but that's the main name for what we think caused it. And the plague was actually not called the Black Death until many years later. It's called this because it would form on your body and your neck specifically, and under your armpits, these big black sores. So that's why they would call it that. Some people thought that pockets of bad air that were released by earthquakes actually caused the plague. Others actually went on to blame Jewish people for bringing the plague to kill Christians. And this idea comes back in the 1940s, when Nazis begin to use this propaganda as a reason why people in Germany should, support the Holocaust. So that was a long-running kind of idea. All right, this is what a plague doctor would have looked like. Now, remember, we learned yesterday that most of these doctors actually weren't doctors. Most of them were dentists or barbers. So, you'd go get your hair cut and then also your bones set by the same person. So these barber doctors would wear these bird beaks or masks. We have been wearing masks in pandemics for pretty much all of time, because even back then, people understood that if you covered your mouth, you could potentially prevent the spread of disease. So they would coat this mask in scented wax so that they wouldn't have to breathe in the air around them. They had breeches or attached long bands connected to their boots. And then these breeches would hold their boots up and they would tuck into their shirt. They had hats and gloves that were made of goat leather, and then they would wear glasses to protect their eyes. The mask had a nose that was 1.5 feet long, and it was shaped like a beak, and it would be filled with perfume with only 2 holes, one on each side near the nostrils, that would allow them to breathe, but also carry the air with herbs so that when the air got to your mouth, it smelled nice. They remember also there's no toothbrushes, so this also helped you not to smell your own breath. And they would carry a rod, and that would allow them to poke or fend off victims who would be clawing at them trying to get help. So, pretty weird looking. All right, we're going to talk about Sardinia now. And then you're going to do a little bit of an activity after you finish your notes about Sardinia. So, this is an island in the Mediterranean Sea. You can see it's next to Italy, in between the Spanish Empire and the Italian Empire at the time. And it was a port city, obviously, because it's an island, and it relied heavily on merchant ships and trade. So obviously, there were a lot of potential there. There was a lot of potential there for the plague to come to this island. So they had what were called morbers, or plague guards, and they would walk the city and they would look out for plague symptoms, specifically people coming in from other places. And they would force those people to quarantine, all words that you know today. So they would look for plague symptoms on merchants coming in the boats from other places, and then they would force them to quarantine if they saw these. So these are where the merchant ships would land. This is what it looks like today. And you can see that walled city, fortified city that would obviously prevent attacks, but it would also prevent people from just getting off their boats and coming into the city without being checked. The morbers would be here. They would line these walls. Here's another beautiful, it's a beautiful, beautiful place, but here's another beautiful part of the city. This is a medieval building still intact. All right, so the Protomedicus. So Sardinia establishes a chief medical administrator. Think of him as the Dr. Fauci of medieval time period. And his title, or this person's title, was the Protomedicus, or the chief medical administrator. And this person was responsible for managing plague outbreaks. We're going to look at Quinto Tiberio Angelerio. I'm sorry, I mispronounced his name. From 1532 to 1617, and he was the Protomedicus in the 1850s. He lived through Sicily's plague in 1575, and he had these new ideas on how to stop it from spreading, and you're going to be looking at those in a minute. So let's look at some of his rules. Angelerio convinced the city's viceroy, meaning like council, to implement strict rules when it came to the plague. Merchants and people in the city were not happy. Kind of sounds like what's happening today, right? However, his rules were adopted when the plague began to spread. And so you can see this is the baptism records, right? And why would there have been fewer baptisms? Because there were fewer babies being born because people weren't surviving, right? So they had the number of baptisms per month, but much fewer in 1583. If you calculate, it was 173, 62 to up to 173. So this would be the year the plague hit. And you can see just in this tiny little island, a massive drop in baptisms because people either weren't having children because they were scared, or they weren't surviving because of the plague. So this is his official book that he wrote, his rules for the plague. And it was published and distributed in 1584. Basically, if we hit a plague again, this is what people should do. After the plague receded, he published his rules to stop the spread of an epidemic. Many are similar to the rules that are used to slow the spread of COVID-19. So we still have some of his same rules now. All right. Go ahead and finish up your notes, and then we'll move on to his rules after